Imagine waking up in a medieval town. The air is heavy with smoke from wood fires, and the streets reek of tanneries, horse manure, and unwashed bodies. Food is simple coarse bread, a little cheese, maybe some salted fish, but it's not exactly dentist approved. Flour is ground with grit from millstones, wearing teeth down to stubs. Sugar hasn't even flooded Europe yet, but people's teeth are still rotting, cracking, and festering because hygiene is a foreign concept. Now, picture the most terrifying truth. If your tooth aches, there is no toothpaste, no mouthwash, no cozy dental clinic with numbing gels and polite dentists asking you to open wide. Instead, your only option is a barber with a rusty pair of pliers or worse. Someone calling themselves a tooth drawer, who probably learned their trade from trial, error, and the screams of their customers. Toothache in the Middle Ages was no small nuisance. It was agony, the kind that drove people mad. In a time when life expectancy hovered around 35, infection could kill you. A rotten tooth wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a ticking time bomb. A doorway for disease that could spread to your jaw, your bloodstream, and eventually your grave, and people knew it. That's why, when the pain became unbearable, they were willing to risk their lives on a so-called dentist whose main qualification was brute strength. But dentistry in the medieval era wasn't even recognized as a medical profession. Doctors, what few there were, looked down on it. They were busy balancing humors, bleeding patients, and scribbling Latin notes. Teeth? That was the dirty work of barbers and blacksmiths. And yes, you heard right, blacksmiths sometimes pulled teeth. If you could shoe a horse or hammer iron, why not wrench a molar out of someone's head? After all, it required the same thing, force. Now imagine sitting in a wooden chair in a dimly lit market square. A crowd gathers because tooth pulling is entertainment. The barber-surgeon shouts promises of relief. He grips your head between his knees, shoves a metal tool into your mouth, and twists. There's no anesthetic, no alcohol strong enough to numb you, except maybe a gulp of cheap ale. The pain is unimaginable. Your body thrashes, but you're held down. Blood pours, the crowd cheers, and if you're lucky, the tooth actually comes out. If you're unlucky, it shatters. Shards remain lodged in your gum. Infection sets in. Your jaw swells, your fever rises, and within days you could be dead. This was the reality. People prayed more than they prepared. Some whispered charms against the toothworm, a mythical creature they believed gnawed holes in teeth and caused decay. They burned herbs, recited incantations, and begged saints for mercy. But when superstition failed, the brute force of a medieval dentist was the only answer. Think about that for a moment. Your life balanced on a stranger's grip strength and the sharpness of his rusty pliers. Every extraction was a gamble. Some survived, some didn't, and still people lined up. Because in the hierarchy of medieval pain, toothache was one of the most dreaded. It was described in manuscripts as worse than broken bones, worse than childbirth, chronic, gnawing, relentless. Enough to make a grown man beg for death, or at least for a barber's bloody hands to end it. So why did being a medieval dentist suck? Because you weren't respected by doctors, yet people depended on you desperately. Because every time you worked, you risked killing someone. Because your clinic was a wooden stool in the street, your tools were barely cleaner than farm equipment, and your patients screamed until their voices broke. Dentistry wasn't just a dirty job, it was a spectacle of suffering. And the cruel irony was this: the worse the pain, the more the crowds loved it. This was the beginning of dentistry in Europe. Primitive, brutal, and terrifying. A world where relief meant blood and survival was never guaranteed. A world where one bad tooth could spell the end. And we're only just getting started. Long before microscopes revealed the real enemy's bacteria, people believed something else was gnawing away at their teeth. Worms. Yes, tiny, invisible worms that burrowed into the enamel, hollowed out the tooth, and feasted on the pulp until pain became unbearable. The idea of the toothworm wasn't some fringe superstition. It was widespread, stretching across cultures from Mesopotamia to medieval Europe. Ancient Sumerian tablets from around 5,000 years ago described the worm's hunger for blood and roots. By the Middle Ages, this belief had hardened into accepted truth. Dentists, barbers, and healers all repeated the story. If your tooth hurt, it was because worms lived inside it. And here's the chilling part: people thought they had proof. When a rotten tooth was finally yanked out, threads of tissue or nerve might dangle from the root. To untrained eyes, those fibers looked exactly like worms. "See," the barber would say, holding it up triumphantly to a groaning patient. "Here is the beast that caused your torment." The crowd would gasp. The myth lived on. But if toothache was caused by worms, how do you kill them? Medieval medicine had answers, though none of them pleasant. Remedies ranged from the bizarre to the downright dangerous. One treatment was fumigation. A patient would sit with their mouth open over a pot of burning herbs, sulfur, or henbane seeds. The smoke was supposed to suffocate the worms. In reality, it only left the sufferer coughing and dizzy, while the pain still pulsed in their jaw. Another popular cure involved dripping hot oils or resins into the cavity. Imagine scalding liquid poured straight into an exposed nerve. The idea was that heat would drive out or kill the worm. In practice, it only charred the tissue and made the agony worse. But patients endured it, desperate for relief. Then there were spells and charms. A healer might recite Latin incantations over the mouth, invoking saints like Apollonia, the patron saint of dentistry. Villagers believed that words, blessed herbs, or even carrying certain amulets could keep the worms away. Some people slept with garlic clove necklaces, not just to ward off evil spirits, but to defend against the dreaded toothworm. Alcohol too played its part. Strong wine or mead was sometimes swished in the mouth, both as a disinfectant and a numbing agent. For a few minutes, the pain dulled, and patients convinced themselves the worm was dying. But when the buzz wore off, the ache returned with double vengeance. And then there were treatments so brutal they sound almost like torture. One medieval text recommended inserting a red-hot needle into the cavity to stab the worm. Another advised using sharp iron instruments to scrape it out. In other words, medieval dentistry sometimes amounted to burning and stabbing inside a mouth without anesthetic. If the pain didn't kill you, the infection might. Still, all of these methods show one thing clearly: people feared their teeth almost as much as they feared the plague. Because the toothworm myth gave suffering a face, it made pain easier to explain. In a world where knowledge was scarce, myths filled the gaps. But the worm wasn't the only explanation. Some physicians tied toothache to astrology, claiming that certain phases of the moon worsened dental pain. Others linked it to the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If your humors were out of balance, your teeth would suffer. Treatments then might include bloodletting or purging, as if draining fluids could cure a cavity. It's easy to laugh at these ideas now, but remember, these were desperate people without access to our modern comforts. They didn't know about nerves, enamel, or bacteria. What they knew was pain-sharp, blinding, relentless pain, and they would try anything to stop it. And yet, all the remedies, all the spells, all the fumigations led to one final truth. When the pain didn't stop, the only solution left was extraction. The barber's pliers waited in the market square. The crowd waited too. Because the moment of reckoning wasn't just medicine, it was theater. If you wanted a tooth pulled in medieval Europe, you didn't book an appointment in a quiet office. You went to the market square. Right beside stalls selling salted fish and bolts of cloth, you'd find a barber-surgeon with his instruments on display. Not polished dental tools, not sterile steel. Instead, iron forceps, pincers, hooks, and knives gleaming in the daylight, ready to clamp down on human mouths. Barber-surgeons were the handymen of medieval medicine. They cut hair, shaved beards, lanced boils, stitched wounds, and even performed amputations. Dentistry was just another dirty job on their long list. Doctors, with their university training and fancy robes, looked down on them. But ordinary people couldn't afford doctors anyway. The barber surgeon was cheap, available, and most importantly strong enough to wrestle with a jaw until a tooth came out. Strength was everything. These men weren't careful. They weren't gentle. Their patients weren't reclining in leather chairs. They were straddling wooden stools, sweating under the stares of curious onlookers. The barber clamped their head between his knees, shoved a metal instrument into the mouth, and pulled with all the force of a man hauling rope. The main tool of choice was the dental pelican, a vicious contraption named for its beak-like shape. It hooked under the gum and leveraged the tooth out with a sickening crack. If you were unlucky, the pelican didn't just yank the tooth, it tore surrounding flesh, shattered bone, or ripped out healthy neighbors. Patients often staggered away bloodied, missing more teeth than they came with. Later came the dental key, another monstrous device resembling a door key. The barber would fit it over the tooth, twist hard, and wrench it out sideways. The risk of breaking jaws was enormous, but when the crowd wanted drama, that mattered little. The screams were part of the show, and make no mistake, it was a show. Tooth pulling wasn't performed in private, it was public entertainment. Town squares buzzed when the barber set up his stool. Children pointed, vendors paused their sales, neighbors gathered to watch. Some came out of curiosity, others out of relief. It wasn't their turn in the chair. The barber played to the audience, promising quick cures and miracle relief. He held up bloody teeth like trophies, sometimes stringing them together as proof of his skill. But skill was questionable. Some barbers were clumsy, others drunk, and a few were outright frauds. They traveled from town to town, boasting loudly of cures, but vanished quickly when patients died from infection. These charlatans made dentistry infamous. It was dangerous enough in skilled hands imagine trusting your mouth to a wandering quack with a dirty apron. Still, people came. Why? Because toothache drove them to it. They weighed the terror of the barber's chair against the relentless stabbing pain in their jaw and chose the barber. For many, it was the only chance at relief. The extraction might leave scars, but at least the worm was gone, the pain silenced. And the barbers knew it. They leaned into the spectacle, turning surgery into performance. In Paris, London, and Florence, tooth pulling was as much street theater as medical service. Crowds laughed, jeered, and sometimes fainted at the sight of spurting blood. A good performance drew new customers, a bad one left bodies. Yet, for all the brutality, there were hints of progress. Some barbers began experimenting with herbs to dull the pain opium, mandrake, or henbane. Others learned to boil their instruments, not out of concern for germs, those were unknown, but to keep metal from rusting. Even in the filth and chaos, dentistry was slowly, painfully stumbling forward. But in the Middle Ages, dentistry was still closer to butchery than science. Patients left the marketplace with bloody rags stuffed in their mouths, their jaws aching, their futures uncertain. Some survived, grateful. Others never recovered. The barber, meanwhile, packed up his tools, wiped the blood on his apron, and waited for the next victim. To him, it was just another day's work. To the patient, it was life or death. And that's why being a medieval dentist sucked not only for the patient, but for the dentist too. Because every pull was a gamble, every performance a risk, and every tooth a reminder that this was a profession born of necessity, not respect. If the barber-surgeon was the grim craftsman of the marketplace, then the tooth-pulling charlatan was the carnival act. These were not sober men in aprons, but performers dressed in bright costumes, strutting through towns with trumpets, drums, and colorful banners. They didn't just promise relief from pain, they promised a spectacle, a miracle, and sometimes even a blessing from heaven itself. Traveling tooth pullers swept into towns like entertainers. They'd set up a stage in the middle of the square, often with assistants who beat drums or played fiddles to draw a crowd. They shouted claims of skill. They could cure toothache instantly, remove the worm, and leave the sufferer grinning in gratitude. They displayed jars of mysterious oils, powders, and tinctures, which they claimed came from exotic lands. In reality, most were wine, vinegar, or crushed herbs with little effect. But the performance mattered more than the cure. The patient, often chosen from the crowd, was placed on the stage. The tooth puller flourished his tools like a magician producing props. He spoke loudly, building suspense. The onlookers leaned in, waiting for the moment of truth. Then came the wrench, the scream, the gush of blood. The tooth was held aloft in triumph. The crowd roared, and the charlatan basked in applause. For the audience, it was theater. For the patient, it was agony. Many of these men were frauds. Some didn't actually pull teeth at all, they staged the act. A Confederate in the crowd pretended to be the patient, screaming convincingly before producing a pre-pulled tooth. Others used sleight-of-hand tricks, distracting the audience with fire breathing, juggling or even crude jokes while making it appear as though they'd performed a miraculous cure. But fraud or not, people believed. Why? Because they wanted to. A toothache could drive even the most skeptical soul into the hands of a showman promising relief. And if the performance ended with blood and a tooth in hand, well, wasn't that proof enough? Of course, the danger was real. Traveling dentists often reused tools without cleaning them, spreading infection from one mouth to another. Their remedies sometimes contained poisonous ingredients, mercury, arsenic, or lead-all common in medieval medicine. And when they botched a job, they were gone the next morning, vanishing down the road before anyone could complain. Still, their popularity endured. Tooth-pulling charlatans became fixtures of medieval fairs and festivals. In a world without newspapers or entertainment, their shocking shows were talked about for weeks. Some even became minor celebrities, known from town to town for their flamboyant performances. Not everyone was impressed. Physicians scoffed at them as mountebanks and cheats. The church sometimes denounced them as sinners who profited from human suffering. But none of that mattered when pain gnawed at a villager's jaw and no other option existed. Charlatans thrived in the space between desperation and hope, offering just enough spectacle to make people believe. And the irony? These showmen helped push dentistry forward in their own twisted way. By drawing crowds, they spread awareness of dental problems. By experimenting with potions and powders, they stumbled on the occasional remedy that actually worked. By dramatizing extractions, they made dental suffering impossible to ignore. The very charlatans who deceived people also kept the idea of dentistry alive in public imagination. For the patient, however, the experience remained brutal. Imagine being hauled onto a stage surrounded by a jeering crowd with a flamboyant stranger jabbing iron into your mouth. There's no dignity, no privacy, just the raw pain of extraction turned into entertainment. The cheers of the audience blend with your own screams until the ordeal ends in blood and humiliation. This is why being a medieval dentist sucked. Because you weren't just a healer or a butcher. You were sometimes an actor, a liar, and a salesman too. Your reputation depended not on the health of your patients, but on the applause of the mob. And every pulled tooth was both a victory and a reminder of the thin line between medicine and spectacle. Not everyone in the Middle Ages dared to sit in the barber's chair or mount the charlatanesque stage. For many, the sight of iron pliers, the memory of neighbors' screams, and the whisper of infection was too much to bear. Instead, they sought relief elsewhere, in the dark world of folk remedies, herbal medicine, and religious devotion. In village homes, toothache wasn't just an ailment. It was a curse, a punishment, a test of faith. Families rummaged through cupboards of dried herbs, bottles of vinegar, and old charms passed down through generations. If steel meant agony, perhaps nature or the divine could bring gentler mercy. The most common household cure was the herbal poultice. Healers recommended crushing garlic cloves, onions, or leeks and pressing the pulp against the aching tooth. Garlic, after all, was thought to chase away evil spirits, and perhaps the toothworm too. Others used sage leaves, chamomile, or clove oil, soaked into cotton and tucked into the mouth. The soothing oil sometimes dulled the pain, offering precious hours of relief. Vinegar and wine were also popular. Patients rinsed their mouths with strong red wine or apple vinegar, believing the sour bite would kill worms and rot. If nothing else, the alcohol numbed the gums for a short while. In some recipes, wine was mixed with crushed peppercorns or ground mustard seeds remedies that burned the mouth almost as fiercely as the tooth itself. For the desperate, there were harsher options. Some texts advised rubbing the gums with arsenic or mercury salts. The pain, indeed, sometimes vanished because the tissue itself was poisoned and destroyed. Patients who survived the remedy often lost not only the bad tooth, but several good ones around it. Still, in a world without anesthesia, even poison could feel like a blessing. But medicine in the Middle Ages wasn't only about herbs and minerals. It was also about the soul. Many sufferers turned to the church, begging saints for mercy. The most popular figure was Saint Apollonia, a Christian martyr whose teeth were shattered during torture in the 3rd century. She became the patron saint of dentistry. In countless villages, people lit candles before her image, whispered prayers. and carried tiny medallions of her likeness to ward off toothache. If the pain lessened, it was said to be her miracle. Some even went on pilgrimages, traveling miles to holy shrines where relics were said to cure dental pain. Pilgrims kissed bones, drank blessed water, or tied scraps of cloth to holy trees. Faith offered what medicine could not. Hope without knives, relief without blood. Superstition played its part too. In rural areas, people buried teeth in the earth to trick the worm into leaving the body. Others tied animal bones to their necks or muttered charms at midnight under the waning moon. One German folk cure advised whispering the toothache into the ear of a dog, believing the pain would transfer to the animal. Another suggested spitting into a frog's mouth. Strange, yes, but to the sufferer any chance was worth it. Then there were the charms inscribed on parchment or carved into wood. Words like abracadabra weren't just nonsense. They were protective formulas believed to drive away illness. A charm might be hung around the neck or pressed against the cheek. If the pain stopped, the healer claimed success. If not, well, perhaps the spell wasn't strong enough and another fee would be required. Despite the desperation, these remedies show something profound. People feared the brutality of dentistry so much, they would try anything else first. Herbs, prayers, charms, even poisons all seemed better than the certainty of blood in the marketplace. But of course these cures rarely lasted. The pain always returned. And when it did, sharper and fiercer than before, the sufferer often had no choice. The prayers had failed, the herbs had failed, the worm still gnawed. At last, trembling and exhausted, they dragged themselves to the barber's stool or the showman's stage. The iron waited. That was the cruel cycle of medieval dentistry: desperation, false hope, and eventual surrender. It wasn't just the patient who suffered, but their families too, watching helplessly as loved ones writhed in pain, powerless until the tooth was torn free. And this is why being a medieval dentist sucked, not just for the tooth puller, but for society as a whole. The field had no science, only superstition. No anesthetic, only ale. No sterile tools, only iron and muscle. The remedies of herbs and prayers delayed the inevitable, but they could not change the end: pain, blood, and risk. The crowd had cheered, the barber had pocketed his fee, and the unlucky patient staggered away with a bloody rag stuffed into his mouth. But the story didn't end there. In fact, for many medieval sufferers, the real ordeal began after the tooth was pulled. The first problem was simple: pain. A tooth extraction without anesthetic left the jaw raw, swollen, and throbbing. Patients often couldn't eat for days. Bread, the staple of medieval life, was nearly impossible to chew with a torn gum. Soups and porridges became survival food, though even swallowing sent jolts of pain through the face. The wound festered, sometimes bleeding for hours or even days. Then came the second, far deadlier problem: infection. In an age before antibiotics, even the smallest wound could turn lethal. A splinter of tooth left behind, a rusty tool scraping bone, or dirty fingers pressing into the mouthful could invite infection. The gum swelled, pus oozed, and fevers set in. Sometimes the swelling spread down the throat, cutting off breathing. Other times it crept upward, clouding the brain in what we now know as sepsis. To a medieval sufferer, it was simply called God's punishment. Many died not from the toothache itself, but from the cure. For those who survived, life changed in quieter but lasting ways. Missing teeth were more than just uncomfortable, they were social markers. In a world where food was coarse and chewing was essential, losing molars meant you couldn't grind bread or meat properly. Malnutrition often followed. Some people adapted by pounding their food softer or soaking bread in broth, but meals became slower, harder, and less satisfying. Appearance mattered too. A gap-toothed smile marked you as old before your time. Youth and beauty were tied to a full set of teeth, and missing them carried a stigma. Court records and literature of the time mocked the toothless as fools, witches, or drunkards. For women especially, missing front teeth could mean lost marriage prospects. In some villages, gossips whispered that toothless women had been cursed for sins or worse, that they were in league with the devil. Speech was another victim. Missing teeth altered pronunciation, turning words slurred or whistling. In a society where oral storytelling and public speech carried weight, this mattered. A tradesman without teeth might lose customers. A priest with gaps might struggle to command authority from the pulpit. Teeth weren't just tools for eating, they were tools for identity. And unlike today, replacements were scarce. False teeth existed, but they were rare, expensive, and crude. Some were carved from bone, ivory, or even the teeth of animals. Others were lashed together with string and stuffed into the mouth like awkward dentures. They didn't fit well, they smelled, and they caused more sores than they solved. Only the wealthy could afford them, and even they wore them sparingly. Ordinary people simply lived with the gaps, hiding smiles behind hands or scarves. But perhaps the strangest part of the aftermath was how society romanticized dental suffering. Saints like Apollonia, who lost her teeth in martyrdom, were revered as holy figures. Poets wrote verses comparing lost teeth to autumn leaves. Chroniclers described kings and nobles with pride, noting how many teeth they still had in old age. Teeth weren't just bones, they were symbols of vitality, wealth, and even divine favor. To lose them was to lose more than function. It was to lose face, status, and often dignity, yet people endured. They endured because there was no alternative. Pain was a part of life in the Middle Ages, as common as hunger or cold. A pulled tooth was just another scar in a body already marked by hardship. People carried on, chewing slowly, speaking with a whistle, and praying the next ache wouldn't come too soon. For the barber surgeon, the aftermath rarely mattered. Once the tooth was out and the coin was earned, the patient was forgotten. Infection, death, disfigurement, these were not his concern. In fact, the worse the outcome, the better his business. Another ache would send another desperate soul to his stool. The cycle of pain and extraction rolled on, generation after generation. This is why being a medieval dentist sucked, not only because the act itself was brutal, but because the consequences followed people long after the blood dried. Every tooth pulled was the beginning of a new struggle, with food, with speech, with appearance, with survival itself. And yet, strangely, it was also the beginning of something bigger. Slowly, painfully, people began to realize that teeth mattered. Not just for chewing, not just for smiling, but for life itself. That realization would, centuries later, drive dentistry out of the marketplace and into universities. But for the poor souls of the Middle Ages, it was too late. Imagine walking into a medieval dentist's chamber. You would not find gleaming stainless steel instruments or sterilized trays laid out neatly. Instead, the tools resembled weapons more than anything meant for healing. Iron forceps, crude pliers, awls, and chisels, objects forged by blacksmiths, not crafted by surgeons. Many were multi-purpose tools, equally capable of pulling a nail from wood as they were of pulling a tooth from bone. The most infamous was the tooth key, a dreadful contraption designed to yank teeth out with a swift twist. It had a claw-like hook at one end and a heavy handle for torque. When placed over a tooth, the claw would bite down as the dentist twisted violently. If everything went well, the tooth would come out whole. But more often, the tooth would shatter, leaving fragments embedded in the gums, leading to infection, abscess, or even death. There was also the practice of using heated metal rods to cauterize rotten teeth. If a patient was writhing in agony, the dentist might press the iron to the tooth in hopes of burning away decay or nerves. The screams, the smoke, the smell of searing flesh was all part of the procedure. Pain was inevitable. There were no anesthetics, no Novocaine, no gentle numbing injections. The closest thing to relief was alcohol, opium, or a prayer. Sometimes assistants would hold the patient down as the dentist worked. In some cases, ropes or even chains were used to restrain them. Dentistry was not just medicine. It was an ordeal of endurance. The instruments themselves were rarely cleaned. Bacteria, of course, were not understood. If an earlier patient bled on the pliers, the next patient inherited not only the tool, but potentially their infection. Wounds festered, jaws swelled, and what began as a toothache often ended in fever and death. And yet, despite the horror, these tools were treasured. They represented progress in an age when alternatives were few. Without them, there was only one solution to dental pain: live with it until it consumed you. For medieval people, a dentist with iron pliers was terrifying, but also a lifeline. The cruelty of the tools wasn't malicious. It was born from necessity and ignorance, forged in fire by craftsmen who had never studied anatomy. Still, every time a patient sat in that chair, or, more often, on a wooden stool in a marketplace, they had to ask themselves, would they leave with less pain, or would they never walk away at all? The tools of medieval dentistry were not just instruments of medicine. They were relics of desperation, symbols of how little people understood their own bodies, and reminders that sometimes seeking a cure was as dangerous as the disease itself. If you ever thought a modern dental drill was terrifying, imagine what instruments a medieval dentist had at their disposal. Their toolkit was less of a precision set and more of a medieval torture chest. Iron pliers, long-hooked forceps, chisels, awls, hammers, and even crude knives, these were the primary weapons against toothaches. Sterilization was non-existent. Rusted blades were reused countless times, caked with dried blood from previous patients. One of the most infamous devices was called a pelican, a metal tool shaped somewhat like the bird's beak. It was wedged against the tooth, then twisted violently to yank it out. Another was the dental key, resembling the handle of a door key, which gripped a tooth and wrenched it sideways, often breaking the jaw in the process. To make matters worse, patients were rarely restrained. Men, women, and even children had to hold still as these brutal instruments tore through flesh and bone. Some accounts describe teeth being chiseled apart piece by piece if they proved too stubborn, the dentist hammering away as blood spattered across their apron. With no anesthesia, every nerve screamed alive, and the pain was so unbearable that some fainted mid-procedure, something the dentist often welcomed, since an unconscious patient was easier to work on. Yet, despite the horror, these tools were treasured. Owning a well-made pelican or dental key meant a barber-surgeon could command higher fees. They even passed them down generations, family heirlooms coated in the suffering of hundreds of mouths. And if you dared complain after the procedure, you were often told the agony was proof of healing. Would you like me to continue with Part 9, where I'll dive into the bizarre and often deadly remedies medieval dentists recommended instead of extractions? Medieval dentistry wasn't just about pulling teeth with iron tools, it was also about strange, often deadly remedies intended to cure the toothache without surgery. People tried anything to avoid the terrifying extraction: poultices, potions, charms, and even poisons. One common practice was the toothworm cure. Believing that worms bored inside teeth caused pain, healers would prescribe fumigation holding the mouth over burning herbs, sulfur or henbane smoke to kill the invisible worm. Sometimes hot oil or wine was poured directly into cavities, scalding the gums in a desperate attempt to drive the worm out. Predictably, this often worsened pain or caused infection. Herbal remedies were widespread. Cloves, garlic, and onions were crushed and pressed against aching teeth. Sage, mint, or chamomile were brewed into rinses. Some remedies mixed wine or vinegar with pepper or mustard to numb the pain. While some actually dulled nerve sensations temporarily, others burned so fiercely that patients sometimes wished they'd just braved the pliers instead. Magic and religion played a huge role. People carried amulets, charms, or inscriptions on parchment, reciting spells or prayers to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of dentistry. Pilgrimages were made to holy sites, relics were kissed, and special ointments blessed by priests were applied. If pain eased, it was credited to divine intervention. If not, the blame fell on the patient's sins. Some more extreme remedies included applying toxic substances like arsenic or mercury to the tooth. These often destroyed tissue, sometimes killing the patient. The belief in humors led some to prescribe bloodletting or purging, claiming that the imbalance caused the ache. Others resorted to placing live animals like frogs on the face or whispering the pain to dogs, believing it would transfer the suffering elsewhere. Despite the bizarre nature of these remedies, they reflect the desperation of the times. People would endure smoke, fire, and poison just to avoid the iron grip of a barber surgeon. And yet, after every failed treatment, they often had no choice but to surrender to the ultimate terror, extraction. In the Middle Ages, losing a tooth was not merely a medical issue, it was a social marker, a sign that could affect how others perceived you. Missing teeth were visible evidence of poverty, age, or neglect. For the poor, who endured harsh diets and brutal dental care, gaps in the mouth were common. But even for wealthier individuals, a lost tooth could carry shame. Food was the first and most obvious problem. Coarse bread, dried meat, and tough vegetables required chewing strength. Without molars, grinding food became difficult, leading to malnutrition over time. People adapted by soaking bread in broth or mashing vegetables, but meals were slower, less satisfying, and often nutritionally incomplete. Speech was another casualty. Losing front teeth altered pronunciation. Certain letters became slurred or whistled, making public speaking, trading, or teaching more challenging. In a society that valued verbal communication and oral storytelling, this was no small handicap. Appearance mattered, too. A smile with gaps could be mocked or misjudged. Literature and folk tales of the era often portrayed toothless characters as foolish, grotesque, or morally corrupt. A toothless woman might face ridicule or reduced marriage prospects, while a toothless man could be seen as weak or unhealthy. In some communities, children with missing teeth were teased mercilessly, leaving psychological scars alongside physical ones. Yet there were paradoxical notions. Some tooth loss, especially in older individuals, was romanticized. Saints like Apollonia, who suffered martyrdom through her teeth, were revered. Toothless elders were sometimes respected as wise survivors, though this respect was reserved for those who survived illnesses and extractions with dignity. For the medieval dentist or barber-surgeon, the consequences of extraction on social life were secondary. Their priority was removing pain, or at least appearing to do so. If a patient lost more than one tooth, suffered infection, or was left with a jaw partially destroyed, it was unfortunate but not their concern. The cycle of pain, extraction, and social consequence was one the public endured with grim acceptance. For many medieval patients, stepping into the barber-s chair was as much a test of courage as it was a medical procedure. The psychological torment began long before the pliers touched the tooth. Rumors of botched extractions, gangrene, and infection spread through villages like wildfire, making each appointment an ordeal of fear. Patients often arrived trembling, held back by friends or family to prevent flight. The mere sight of the barber's instruments, twisted metal, hooks, and keys was enough to send shivers down the spine. People reported feeling their hearts pound, palms sweat, and stomachs churn as they watched the barber sharpen or test the tools on wood or bone. The anticipation of pain was magnified by the public nature of many extractions. In marketplaces, crowds gathered to watch, turning medicine into theater. The patient's fear was amplified by the jeers, laughter, and occasional screams from previous victims. Every sound became a warning. The agony was coming, and there was no escape. Even those who survived the procedure reported long-lasting trauma. Nightmares, jaw-clenching, and anxiety about future dental problems haunted them. For children, the experience could be formative, teaching that medicine itself was dangerous and terrifying. Adults often developed coping rituals, praying, chewing herbs, or holding on to loved ones' hands to endure the ordeal. Barber-surgeons sometimes exploited this fear. A well-timed display of tools, a dramatic twist of the wrist, or a theatrical shout could make the procedure seem even more miraculous or terrifying depending on the crowd's reaction. The psychological manipulation reinforced their authority. Pain and fear were inseparable from the barber's role. Yet the terror wasn't purely negative. In a paradoxical way, it created a kind of communal bonding. Villagers shared tales of who screamed loudest, whose jaw was most mangled, and which barber was the most skilled or most ruthless. These stories traveled from town to town, forming a collective memory of suffering and survival. By the end of the extraction, the patient often felt a mix of relief and trauma. The tooth was gone, but the memory of agony lingered. This psychological legacy was one of the reasons medieval dentistry was feared across generations. Medieval dentistry was a gamble, and sometimes the stakes were fatal. Stories of botched extractions, maimed jaws, and fatal infections were common, and they spread terror faster than any warning sign could. Every patient entering a barber-surgeon's chair risked more than just pain. They risked permanent disfigurement or death. One of the most notorious disasters involved the overzealous use of the dental key. The clawed instrument, designed to grip and twist teeth out, could easily slip. In some recorded cases, the key fractured a patient's jaw or ripped gums entirely away from the bone. The resulting wounds often festered, leading to abscesses, gangrene, or systemic infection. The unlucky victims faced weeks of suffering and sometimes death without further medical recourse. Patients weren't always restrained properly, especially children or the elderly. A sudden jerk could turn a routine extraction into a catastrophe. Teeth could break in half, leaving shards embedded in the gums. Sometimes entire rows of teeth were loosened or removed unintentionally. There are accounts of patients losing several teeth in a single session, unable to chew solid food for months afterward. Infections were another deadly outcome. With instruments rarely cleaned, bacteria spread quickly. A minor extraction could escalate into swelling that traveled to the throat, blocking breathing or into the bloodstream, causing sepsis. The simplest procedure, yanking a decayed tooth, was potentially lethal, and since antibiotics were centuries away, even minor infections could prove fatal. Some disasters were caused by experimental or desperate remedies. Barbers occasionally applied heated irons, caustic chemicals, or toxic herbs to avoid extraction or to cauterize teeth. These treatments often burned surrounding tissue, poisoned patients, or exacerbated decay. When patients survived, they were left with permanent damage and chronic pain. Despite these horrors, barber surgeons continued their work, driven by demand and the lack of alternatives. Communities, familiar with the risks, often accepted dental disasters as part of life. A few survived to tell the story, passing down cautionary tales that warned future patients of which barbers to avoid. The repeated failures and disasters contributed to the slow evolution of dentistry. By observing which tools and techniques caused less harm, some barber surgeons gradually improved methods. But for centuries, dental work remained as much a gamble as a treatment. Medieval dentistry wasn't merely a medical practice, it was a theater of fear. Barber surgeons knew that terror sold their services. They relied on spectacle, superstition, and psychological manipulation to draw patients in and convince them to submit to their brutal treatments. In marketplaces, barbers set up small stages, displaying gleaming tools like trophies. Jars of herbs, strange powders, and bottles of murky liquids were lined up, giving the impression of exotic and magical remedies. Sometimes they would stage mock extractions on objects, wood, animal jaws, or even dolls to demonstrate their skill. The more dramatic the display, the larger the crowd, and the more customers willing to endure the pain. Superstition was another weapon. Patients were often convinced that toothaches were caused by evil spirits, worms, or curses. Barbers capitalized on these beliefs, claiming that their tools and potions could drive out demons or evil worms lodged in the gums. They might chant incantations, sprinkle herbs, or hold talismans over the patient's mouth, creating a sense of ritualized authority. Fear and faith intertwined, making patients more likely to comply. The theatrics were not just for show. They distracted the patient from the pain, creating a temporary psychological buffer. The flurry of motion, the shouting, and the drama of extraction could focus the mind on the spectacle rather than the agony in the mouth. For the barber, it was a practical tactic. A distracted patient moved less, making the extraction easier, though still brutal. Children were especially targeted by fear and superstition. Parents brought them to barbers under threat of eternal torment from tooth worms if the ache was ignored. The combination of ritual, showmanship, and parental pressure made even the youngest patients sit still, trembling but compliant. These performances also reinforced the barber's authority. Pain and spectacle weren't incidental, they were proof of power. If the procedure was excruciating, the patient might believe it was effective. If the tooth came out successfully, the barber's reputation soared. Every show reinforced the idea that the barber held not just tools, but control over life, death, and suffering. Yet the cost was high. Patients sometimes left with more than missing teeth. They left with trauma, infection, and fear that lingered for life. The spectacle, designed to impress and terrify, often blurred the line between medicine and entertainment. Medieval dentistry didn't stop at pulling teeth, it often ventured into bizarre, dangerous, and outright deadly territory. Barbers and barber-surgeons experimented with remedies that ranged from the almost plausible to the grotesquely cruel, reflecting a time when understanding of medicine was limited and desperation ran high. One common practice involved applying toxic substances directly to the gums or decayed teeth. Mercury, arsenic, and lead were frequently used, sometimes as powders or ointments, sometimes as ingredients in herbal mixtures. The goal was simple: kill the tooth or balance humors. The result was often anything but simple. Patients could suffer burns, systemic poisoning, or even death. The line between treatment and execution was thin. Bloodletting was another method employed to combat toothache. Based on the humoral theory of medicine, barbers believed that excess blood or bad humors caused pain and disease. A patient might have a vein opened in the arm or even the gums themselves punctured to release this excess. Rather than curing the tooth, the procedure often weakened the patient, increased infection risk, and sometimes hastened death. Magical remedies also proliferated. Charms, spells, and inscriptions were used alongside herbal concoctions, creating a strange hybrid of superstition and science. A typical mixture might combine crushed cloves, garlic, and sage with a prayer written on a scrap of parchment. The patient was expected to chew, swallow, or apply this paste while reciting prayers, hoping both medicine and magic would work. Some barbers used fire in frightening ways. Heated metal rods or red-hot pokers were applied to the gums in an attempt to cauterize infection or kill the worm. While occasionally it might temporarily dull pain, more often it caused burns, swelling, and long-term tissue damage. Even bizarre animal practices were employed. Patients might be instructed to whisper their pain into a dog's ear, feed a frog, or bury teeth in the earth. These rituals reflected deep-seated beliefs that toothaches had spiritual causes, and while ineffective medically, they reveal the creativity and desperation of the era. The deadliest practices often involved overzealous extractions combined with these other methods. A tooth pulled with a dental key, followed by toxic ointment and fire, left the patient at extreme risk. Infection, poisoning, and injury combined to make recovery unlikely. Some patients died within days, leaving communities to whisper warnings about the barber or superstitions surrounding toothache. Despite the danger, these practices persisted for centuries. Demand was constant and alternatives were few. Patients balanced fear, hope, and necessity, often choosing the lesser of two evils: endure the brutal extraction or gamble with mysterious remedies that could kill them slowly. Amid the chaos and cruelty of medieval dentistry, a slow transformation began, one that would eventually lay the foundations for modern dental science. Even in a world dominated by iron pliers, toxic potions, and superstition, some practitioners began to experiment, observe, and document, pushing dentistry from terror toward knowledge. Barbers and barber-surgeons, despite their gruesome methods, were among the first to notice patterns. They recorded which tools caused fewer complications, which poultices eased pain, and which extractions led to infections. While rudimentary, these observations represented the seeds of empirical thinking. Over time, some barbers began modifying instruments, creating smaller pliers, sharper chisels, and more precise dental keys designed to remove teeth more cleanly and reduce jaw damage. The introduction of anatomical studies played a crucial role. As universities grew, scholars dissected human and animal bodies, learning the structure of teeth, gums, and jawbones. This knowledge slowly filtered down to practitioners, who could make more informed decisions about extractions and treatments. Understanding the anatomy allowed dentists to minimize collateral damage. Even if anesthesia and sterilization were still centuries away, herbal remedies also evolved. While many concoctions were still ineffective or dangerous, experimentation led to safer, more effective treatments. Cloves, for example, were discovered to have mild anesthetic properties, temporarily numbing the gums. Wine, vinegar, and certain herbs were refined into tinctures that reduced pain and infection risk. Slowly, medieval experimentation laid the groundwork for natural dental medicine. The social perception of dentistry began to change as well. Scholars, physicians, and some wealthy patrons started valuing skill over spectacle. Barber-surgeons who documented their successes gained respect, while the flamboyant traveling charlatans were gradually marginalized. Dentistry began moving from marketplaces to clinics, from public spectacle to professional craft. Yet progress was incremental. Pain, infection, and superstition remained common. Medieval patients continued to endure suffering, though slightly less deadly than before. Each small improvement, however, marked a step toward a future where toothaches could be treated scientifically rather than theatrically or superstitiously. By the end of this period, dentistry straddled two worlds, one of fear, spectacle, and superstition, and another of observation, experimentation, and emerging science. The lessons learned in bloodied marketplaces and crowded village squares would ripple forward, influencing generations of dentists to come. In the medieval world, dentistry was learned not in universities or hospitals, but through apprenticeships, a system both rigorous and brutal. Young boys, often as early as 12, were taken under the wing of a master barber-surgeon. Their education was a mixture of observation, repetition, and direct experience, sometimes painfully acquired. The apprentices' first lessons were simple: cleaning and maintaining tools. They learned to sharpen pliers, polish forceps, and forge or repair rudimentary instruments like chisels and the dreaded dental key. Mistakes at this stage were usually harmless, but even minor errors could later result in broken jaws or torn gums. Precision mattered, though the methods to achieve it were crude. Observation was the next stage. Apprentices watched countless extractions, noting how the master positioned the patient, twisted the tool, and controlled the flow of blood. They memorized which herbs were used for poultices, how to prepare alcohol or vinegar rinses, and which charms accompanied treatment. Every detail counted. A single misstep could mean pain, infection, or death for the patient and potential ruin for the barber's reputation. Hands-on experience followed, often under strict supervision. The first procedures assigned to apprentices were typically minor: pulling small, loose teeth, applying herbal pastes, or assisting with patient restraint. Even at this level, the work was not without risk. Many apprentices suffered cuts, bites, or burns as they learned the delicate and deadly balance between force and precision. Training also involved psychological conditioning. Apprentices were taught to endure the sights, sounds, and smells of extraction. Blood, screams, and the wailing of terrified children were constant companions. Developing a thick skin was essential. Those who flinched or hesitated were considered unfit to continue. Hesitation could be fatal in a profession where speed and decisiveness were crucial. Formal education, where it existed, supplemented practical training. Some barber-surgeons studied rudimentary anatomy from manuscripts, learning about teeth, gums, and jaw structures. Others experimented with herbs, poisons, and rudimentary hygiene practices, documenting successes and failures. These early records, though inconsistent and often superstitious, laid the groundwork for more scientific approaches in later centuries. Apprenticeships were grueling, but they ensured the continuity of knowledge. Techniques, both effective and horrifying, were passed down from generation to generation. Mistakes became lessons, and stories of disaster warned future practitioners of the dangers of carelessness. By the time an apprentice became a master, they had endured years of training, witnessed countless extractions, and carried the weight of responsibility for human lives. The horrors they observed, the pain they inflicted, and the lives they saved shaped a new generation of dental practitioners still brutal by modern standards, but gradually edging towards skill, knowledge, and eventually science. Surviving a medieval dental extraction was only the beginning of a long and challenging recovery. Patients who lived through the terror of the barber's chair faced lingering pain, infection, and the daily consequences of missing teeth. Life after extraction required adaptation, resilience, and sometimes creative problem-solving. The first challenge was eating. Without molars to grind bread, meat, and vegetables, patients had to alter their diets. Porridges, soups, and softened foods became staples. Hard or coarse foods were avoided, not only because of pain, but also due to the risk of dislodging healing gums or causing further injury. Families often had to adjust meals to accommodate the wounded, turning basic survival into a communal effort. Speech was also affected. Missing front teeth altered pronunciation, making words slurred or whistled. In a society that valued oral communication storytelling, trade negotiations, public declarations, this could affect social standing and livelihood. Some adapted by practicing speech, while others simply learned to smile less and speak cautiously, hiding their gaps. Pain and infection remained constant companions. Even minor wounds could fester, leaving swelling, pus, or throbbing discomfort for weeks. Without modern antibiotics, patients had to rely on herbal poultices, rinses, and prayer to prevent complications. Chronic jaw pain was common, a reminder of the extraction that could flare up at the slightest provocation. Appearance and social perception also shaped post-extraction life. Tooth loss was a visible marker of age, poverty, or suffering. Women worried about marriage prospects, men about trade and social respect. Some wore scarves or covered their mouths while speaking, while others accepted the gap as an unavoidable fact of life. Literature and art of the time often highlighted missing teeth as symbols of hardship, further reinforcing societal stigma. Yet not all was despair. Communities developed coping strategies. Folk remedies continued to provide some relief, as shared experiences of dental suffering created bonds of empathy and understanding. Stories of resilience circulated, how a child survived multiple extractions, how a tradesman adapted to his toothless diet, how families cared for the wounded. Patients also learned psychological resilience. Enduring the barber's chair, the blood, the pain, and the aftermath cultivated a toughness that influenced their perception of future suffering. Pain management, patience, and adaptation became essential life skills. Those who survived often passed down knowledge to children, teaching them early how to cope with toothaches and the inevitable extraction that would follow. In short, life after extraction was a blend of hardship, adaptation, and survival. Patients carried both the physical and social consequences of medieval dentistry, living with gaps, altered speech, and a lasting memory of terror. Yet, through this endurance, they also preserved the knowledge and practices that would eventually evolve into safer, more scientific dental care. Medieval dentistry left behind not just a trail of pain and missing teeth, but also stories and legends that fascinated and terrified communities for generations. Some of these tales were exaggerated, some true, but all served as cautionary tales about the dangers of visiting a barber surgeon. One infamous story comes from 14th century France, where a barber was said to have extracted teeth from an entire family in a single day. According to chronicles, the father, mother, and 3 children endured the procedure without anesthesia. The father reportedly lost all his molars, the mother her front teeth, and the children a mixture of incisors and canines. The family survived but suffered chronic pain and difficulty eating for years. This tale spread through villages, warning others of the risks of extraction without caution. In England, the legend of a wandering barber surgeon who pulled teeth by moonlight became notorious. People whispered that he could remove a tooth in under a minute, but sometimes his patients never left alive. Local clergy reportedly invoked prayers to protect villagers, claiming the barber's tools were cursed. These legends mixed fact with superstition, creating a mythology around dentistry that blurred medicine and magic. Other stories focused on miraculous survival. Chroniclers recounted peasants who endured multiple extractions and emerged resilient, able to chew and speak again despite missing teeth. These accounts emphasized human endurance and reinforced the social importance of teeth as markers of survival and strength. Some legends also highlighted the symbolic nature of teeth in medieval culture. Teeth were seen as indicators of character, health, and even morality. Losing teeth could signify divine punishment or misfortune, while surviving extractions might be interpreted as proof of faith or fortitude. Saints like Apollonia, who lost her teeth in martyrdom, were revered, creating a spiritual dimension to dental suffering. Famous cases often served dual purposes. They were entertainment and warning. Town criers and storytellers recounted them in markets, churches, and taverns. Parents used these stories to scare children into good dental habits, or at least to prepare them mentally for inevitable extractions. Communities internalized the risk and spectacle of medieval dentistry, and the legends became part of collective memory, influencing behavior, belief, and the development of dental practice itself. By the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, dentistry began to transition from brutal spectacle to professional practice. The horrors of bloodied marketplaces, iron pliers, and toxic remedies slowly gave way to observation, technique, and emerging science. This shift was gradual, driven by scholars, physicians, and practical experience rather than sudden discovery. Universities and medical schools played a pivotal role. Anatomy was studied more rigorously, with dissections revealing the structure of teeth, gums, and jawbones. Physicians began documenting cases, noting which instruments caused damage, which herbs eased pain, and which techniques prevented infection. Knowledge moved from oral tradition and apprenticeship alone into written records, allowing cumulative learning. Instruments improved as well. Dental keys became smaller and more precise. Forceps were redesigned to grip teeth without crushing surrounding tissue. Heated irons and caustic chemicals were slowly replaced with safer poultices, alcohol rinses, and herbal anesthetics like clove oil. These innovations reduced both mortality and long-term suffering. Professional ethics also began to emerge. Dentists were expected to balance effectiveness with safety. Whereas medieval barber-surgeons prioritized spectacle, fame, or profit, the new approach emphasized patient care. Treating pain effectively without unnecessary harm became a core principle, laying the groundwork for modern dental standards. Social perception shifted alongside technique. Dentistry moved out of marketplaces and taverns into dedicated clinics. The fear that had once surrounded dental care remained, but it was tempered by increasing trust in trained professionals. The symbolic and social importance of teeth persisted, but the focus shifted from survival to health, appearance, and quality of life. Despite these advances, the legacy of medieval dentistry lingered. People still feared extractions, remembered the tales of pain and infection, and continued using herbal remedies. But the seeds of science had been planted. Observation, documentation, and cautious experimentation paved the way for anesthesia, sterilization, and eventually modern dentistry centuries later. Being a medieval dentist was, without exaggeration, one of the most gruesome, dangerous, and thankless professions in history. It demanded skill, courage, and a high tolerance for blood, screams, and disease, but the risks were enormous, both for the dentist and the patient. For the dentist, physical danger was constant. Instruments were heavy, sharp, and unrefined. One slip could break a jaw, sever a lip, or even cause injury to the dentist themselves. Bloodborne infections were poorly understood, and every patient carried the potential for disease. Barber-surgeons had to endure the smells of decay, blood, and burned flesh, daily conditions that would sicken most people. Psychologically, the work was punishing. Dentists faced terrified, writhing patients, children screaming, and the weight of responsibility for human lives. Mistakes could maim or kill. The barber's reputation depended on survival as much as skill, and any failure became the subject of village gossip, legend, and fear. Many endured public scorn if extractions went wrong. Socially, their position was ambiguous. They were respected for their skill, yet feared for the pain they inflicted. They occupied a liminal space between healer and executioner, medical practitioner and performer. Communities relied on them, yet whispered warnings about the dangers of trusting their hands. And yet, despite the horror, medieval dentists were necessary. Toothaches were relentless, infections deadly, and no effective alternatives existed. Their brutal methods, horrifying as they were, often provided relief when nothing else could. Each pull, each cauterization, and each potion was a desperate attempt to combat pain with the limited knowledge and tools available. Ironically, the profession's darkness laid the groundwork for modern dentistry. Experiments, failures, and observations from centuries of painful practice gradually led to safer techniques, better instruments, and a scientific understanding of oral health. The next time you sit in a modern dental chair, numb and comfortable, remember, it all began with a world of iron pliers, dental keys, and unimaginable screams. Being a medieval dentist sucked not because of laziness or incompetence, but because they worked at the edge of knowledge, facing the worst pain humanity could endure with the crudest tools imaginable. They were part scientist, part torturer, and part performer, navigating a world where every tooth carried the potential for agony or death. And that, in the bloodied and twisted history of dentistry, is why surviving medieval dental care or wielding its tools was truly a nightmare